Well, class, today what I would like to do is to begin a discussion about how we got our Bible, especially how the section of the Bible, the New Testament, actually came to be shaped. So this will be a discussion about the nature of Scripture and the nature especially of the New Testament. So what was Scripture in Jesus' day? Well, let's kind of start at that point. Before anything of the New Testament is written down, what did Jesus imagine Scripture to be? Well, we do know that the New Testament, both in the Gospels and Paul and Peter and other writers, all make frequent references to Scripture, and that's the term that's used. And here we're almost always talking about the Old Testament. And specifically, we're talking about the Torah and the prophets and the Psalms. These are the major references to Scripture. Notice what Matthew talks about here. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill them. And the law and the prophets here are two segments, two categories of the larger Old Testament Scripture. But at this point in Jesus' time, the canon of the Scripture had not yet been defined. By canon, we mean here the limit of the Scripture, that which says this is in and this is out. At the time of Jesus, there are a number of writings, and clearly he refers to a number of them, but a number of them are still kind of up in the air. For instance, some Scriptures accepted more books, that is, books that we would now call the Apocrypha, based upon the Greek version of the Old Testament. Did the Sadducees know and accept the book of Daniel? Well, book of Daniel talks about resurrection from the dead. Sadducees denied the resurrection of the dead, so it's possible they either didn't know it or accept that book at all. We do know that the book of Enoch was popular in Qumran, which is a part of Judaism. Was it considered Scripture? Well, quite possibly. We know that it was referenced in 2 Peter and Jude, and by certain scriptures. So there's a lot of variety here about, what was considered Scripture. We know there's a core that everybody accepted, but there was quite a bit of variation around the outside. But certainly we do know, as returning to the New Testament, that in the Gospels and the Epistles, that a number of these writers really just breathed the Old Testament. The Old Testament was Scripture for them in a way that kind of really defined their definition of who they saw themselves to be. Many times the Old Testament is turned to prove Jesus' nature and divinity. Certainly in the book of Matthew this is true. A number of times the Old Testament is referred to or alluded to in various ways to make sense of Jesus' role in a larger scope of the Old Testament, progression of the Old Testament. We know that Jesus used the Old Testament himself in the basis of his own preaching. For instance, in Luke 4, when he's preaching a sermon in Nazareth, he cites Isaiah 61. And certainly he alludes to Scripture in a number of times, as for instance in John 10, when he uses the shepherd imagery that is drawn out of both Jeremiah and Ezekiel. So what is Scripture? Well, the word Scripture here literally means just writing. The Greek word is graphe, and it simply means something that is written out. But it takes on this special meaning of authoritative writing. So when the Scripture is this authoritative writing that people refer to in a way that they can count on. Notice how 2 Timothy defines this term. Every Scripture is inspired by God and useful for teaching, for showing mistakes, for correcting, and for training character. Now, every Scripture there isn't just any writing. Clearly, these are a cluster of writings that were considered to be authoritative. Now, when we turn to the New Testament, so far we've really been considering Scripture as Old Testament, but we turn to the New Testament. What becomes Scripture of the New Testament at the time it was written wasn't Scripture yet. That is, these were various documents that were being written for the most part without any self-understanding of being or becoming Scripture. They were letters that Paul wrote to various churches. They were remembrances of who Jesus was. And they're written over a long period of time, 40 to 50 years certainly, in various regions of Palestine and the world at the time, and written for a number of situations. It was only later that they began to be considered scripture, and so we want to consider how that process went about. But first, let's take a look at kind of some of the timeline of these writings. The very first books of the New Testament that were written were actually some of Paul's early letters. He writes 1 Thessalonians, for instance, as early as 50 A.D. 1 Corinthians is shortly after that, maybe around 52. The last of his letters were probably written no later than 62 A.D. So here we have a period of letters that were written from the 50s to 60s. Notice, though, that this is probably written before any of the Gospels, because we imagine that the first Gospel that was written is the Gospel of Mark, was likely written around 60 to 65, certainly before 70. Matthew is written shortly afterwards, 75 to 80. Luke and Acts maybe 85, maybe 90, it's hard to tell. And the Gospel of John, we're not entirely sure. Some scholars, many scholars place it as late as 90, and some, including myself, tend to place it early. But in any case, none of them are before any of the letters that Paul wrote. Other letters of the New Testament, for instance, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, so on, were almost all written later than that. That is, anywhere from 70 to 90. And the book of Revelation was probably written as late as 95 AD. So we have these various documents that were written over a fairly long stretch of period of time, and which later became collected into this thing we call the New Testament. So here I have a timeline that just kind of shows how Paul is early, and then we have the Gospels and other letters and Revelation in some kind of a timeline. Now, the books of our New Testament are not the only books that were being written at the same time period. There were, for instance, other Gospels. The Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas. We know of references to some lost Gospels, Gospel of Hebrews and Nazarenes, and some later Gospels, infancy Gospels. And these are non-canonical Gospels and generally were later. But there's some indication that some were fairly early. For instance, Peter and Thomas, both some scholars have considered to be earlier than our written Gospels in the New Testament. Not entirely sure about that, but it's possible that they were fairly early. Here's a couple of examples from these non-canonical Gospels. Here from the first Gospel of Peter, which we only have fragments of. And they fulfilled all things and brought to completion the sins on their head. Now many went about with their lamps, and thinking that it was night, they laid down, and the Lord cried out, saying, my power, you have abandoned me. Notice that this is essentially recording the final hours of Jesus on the cross. And the language kind of sounds similar to our Gospels, but instead of saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's my power, you have abandoned me, which is kind of strikingly different here. Or similarly, also in the Gospel of Peter, at the discovery of the empty tomb, for instance, here, we actually have an account of the stone rolling itself away. And then as these soldiers watch, they see 3 men leaving the tomb, supporting a third, and a cross followed them. So a cross walks out of the tomb behind these 3 men, and then as they exit the tomb, the heads of these people grow, and clearly the one of them is Jesus, who reaches the skies, and they hear a voice from the skies saying, have you preached to those that sleep? And the answer is heard from the cross, who says yes. So the cross speaks. Well, that's, we don't have an account of this in any of the other Gospels, and probably a pretty good reason why this never made it into the canon. The Gospel of Thomas has some similar accounts that sound kind of Jesus-y, but but maybe not so Jesus-y. I am the light that is over all things. I am all. From me all came forth, and to me all is attained. Split a piece of wood, I'm there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there. Or a similar one from Gospel of Thomas. Peter says, make Mary leave us, for females don't deserve life. But Jesus says, look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. That doesn't sound like Jesus to me at all. And you can see why the Thomas perhaps never made it into the canon, even if it was written fairly early. We also have a number of other documents that were very popular at the time of the early church. Shepherd of Hermas, the Didache, some other letters that ultimately were very popular but never made it into this collection we call the New Testament, the canon of the New Testament. So how did all this collection come about? How did we take these various documents that were being written and circulating around in the church in the first number of centuries, or first century really, and how did they finally kind of winnow them out to say these are scripture and these aren't? Well, let's consider. Well, first thing we might want to consider is whether the very stage process of collection may have begun with Paul's letters himself. There's a lot of indication that Paul's letters fairly early on were collected into a book in some significant ways. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest this that we can't really go into here too much, but scholars oftentimes point to various endings of the Gospel of Romans, in the book of Romans, and some textual variation in the book of Ephesians to suggest that these were both possibly connected to this formation of a book collection of all of Paul's letters. Certainly, when we get to 2 Peter, we have some pretty good evidence that in fact that these letters were being collected into a book. Notice how 2 Peter says here, so also our beloved brother Paul wrote to you according to the wisdom, speaking as he does in all his letters. Notice the plural. There are some things in them hard to understand, which the ignorant and unable to twist to their own destruction, as they do the other scriptures. So this would indicate, number one, that there already were known a number of letters and possibly a collection into some unit, and that they're possibly already being considered scripture in a way that they would have compared it to the Old Testament. Another indication of some early recognition of some of these books as being particularly special is the fact that we have evidence of wide distribution of the Gospels. For instance, we have early papyri, even of the Gospel of John, in Egypt from as early as 125 A.D. Well, this is maybe only, 50 years after they were written, and remember that book reproduction was difficult, it was handwritten, and the fact that they have made it as far away as Egypt this early suggests that some of them were being recognized very early on as important. Furthermore, we know that, and we'll run across this later in the semester, that Mark was a source for the writing of Matthew and Luke. That means that Mark was considered valuable enough that both Matthew and Luke used the core of that gospel to write and add more materials around that. So we know, for instance, that this would give evidence that Mark was broadly used and distributed, and that in many ways perhaps also Matthew and then Luke also were distributed broadly in a similar way. We also have some pretty good evidence that very early on other writers considered these Gospels as scripture. So one example here is St. Ignatius, who is an early writer, around just a little after the turn of the century, around 110, and that he seems to be quoting Matthew and John, although he doesn't cite them as Matthew and John. The issue of titles is interesting because we're not sure that the Gospels early on had titles, but he seems to cite Matthew and John, and also Paul from the book of Romans and First Corinthians in his book as authoritative, which is to say scriptural. So what do we have as we turn the first century after Jesus? Jesus dies around 30. We have a number of books written starting around 50 by Paul, and Gospels starting around 70. And we get to the end of the century, and we can say that certainly there were a number of texts were available of varying status. So some became part of our final New Testament, some didn't. Certainly some Gospels were given special attention to, as we indicated. Matthew and Luke paid special attention to Mark, and then they became more popular than Mark in later terms. We know that some of Paul's letters were already circulating, and certainly, as 2 Peter indicated, were used with authority. And yet, what we can say is that at this stage, there's no such thing as a canon. And by canon, we mean a standard, a reference point that says this is authoritative, this is true, and this over here, we might be interested in it, but it's not authoritative. That's what a canon means. And at the end of the first century, there's no canon to define what is truly Scripture and what is truly not. As we move farther along into the second century, though, things start to kind of roll along in a way that causes canonization to become an important issue. First one that we want to talk about is Marcion. Marcion is one of our earliest heretics. He actually didn't believe in the God of the Old Testament and really rejected the Old Testament to a great extent. And he was very critical about other books of the New Testament. So he took Luke and kind of reduced it to a short Luke, and he took Paul and he rejected the other ones. And what that did, though, is cause the rest of the church to say, wait a second, some of this stuff's pretty important, and we need to hold on to it. So this selection of a canon really begins as a counterpoint, a counter reaction to Marcion. And the first one to really kind of take this on is a fellow by the name of Irenaeus of Lyon, from now modern-day France. And he writes in a large book called Against Heresies, argues for a number of scriptures. And in particular, for instance, he argues for all four of the Gospels that we now have, no fewer and no more. So he rejects the idea that we could have a bunch of other Gospels, like, for instance, the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Thomas, nor that we could do away with any one of the four that we do have, that we have to have all of these four. And important for him is to suggest that there's two kind of criteria that are going on here. One is apostolicity, that is that these texts can be tracked in some way back to the apostles. And secondly, that both of them are broadly used within the church, and that certifies their reliability. We move forward, and I'll go through this rather quickly, but we have an early list called the Muratorian Canon from shortly after Irenaeus' time that includes a number of books that they consider Scripture, all four of the Gospels and only those four, the Book of Acts, Book of Paul, some of Paul, we're not sure how many of those, but also they include some books from the Apocrypha, and also some that never made it ultimately into the canon. We turn a little bit farther, and there's a controversy about Tatian's Diatessaron. So Tatian took the four Gospels and combined them into a single Gospel that reduced overlap and duplication, as kind of a simple form of the four gospel story collapsed together. And yet that was rejected by the early church. They ultimately said, no, we have to have the four Gospels, distinct four Gospels, and that any attempt to kind of combine them is inappropriate. Moving forward in the Roman sphere, Tertullian also had a list that he considered important, and he has the four Gospels as the Gospel, but according to Mark, according to John, and so on. and then he also refers to one of the criterion here of accepted books were written by apostles or apostolic men, and he includes a number of other books that we make reference to. But notice he excluded the book of Hebrews, and he includes the Shepherd of Hermas, which later was not accepted as a book of the Bible. So our first stage in this canonical construction, we find that by about the end of the 2nd century, that a number of people have already defined the 4 Gospels for sure as essential to the canon, and a number of books of Paul as essential or part of the canon, although they're not explicit about all of the books of Paul or which books are Paul or absolutely. And so there's a whole bunch of other, once we get past just the 4 Gospels and Paul and some of Paul, there's a lack of definition about a number of other books. So we have still kind of this sea of books, some which later on became part of our New Testament, and others that weren't, still kind of in this vague category of, well, maybe. Moving forward now into the 3rd century, a fellow by the name of Origen in Alexandria extensively researched this, and noticed that he now definitely includes the 4 Gospels and Acts and 14 of the Pauline letters, and also accepts James, 1 John, 1 Peter, Revelation, although he has some doubts about Jude and 2 Peter and 2nd and 3rd John. So notice that we're getting a little bit more definition about what's in and what's out. Similarly, we have a list from Dionysius of Alexandria. And so as we move another century forward, by the end of the 2nd century, we have, in the beginning of the 3rd, we have a pretty clear indication that the fourfold gospel is absolutely part of the canon of Scripture, and that for the most part, all of Pauline letters are there, except possibly the pastoral epistles sometimes are doubted, and Hebrews is sometimes considered Paul and sometimes not. But at the same time, other letters are now starting to appear in these gospel lists, in these scripture lists, especially 2 Peter, Jude. 2nd, 3rd John are in this uncertain category. Revelation is uncertain. And periodically, some of these other documents still show up: Shepherd of Hermas, the Didache, Epistle of Barnabas. So we're a little bit firmer as we move into the next stage of our consideration. When we get to the 4th century, Eusebius of Caesarea really becomes a little bit more definite about this, and suggests here that only a few books are disputed, and pretty much rejects any of the other books that were periodically trying to make entry into our scripture. So he defines it a bit more, and finally, in 367 A.D. C.E. Athanasius, the bishop of Alexandria, who became one of the protagonists in finally this early church creed called the Nicene Creed. He writes a letter in 367 to his churches under his oversight, which lists all 27 books of our current New Testament as Scripture. And that list includes nothing that is not part of our Scripture. And furthermore, then also addresses some other popular books, Wisdom of Solomon, Shepherd of Hermas, Didache, as permitted reading, but they're not Scripture. And so he's the first one to kind of draw the line quite tightly. Moreover, as we turn to then around the same time period, some of the great codices, these are early books where everything is being brought together in book form. And we have 3 of them, Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus, that are these great uncial codexes. And for the most part, they also follow very closely this list that Athanasius had, with some slight variations. For instance, Vaticanus apparently didn't include 2 Peter. Sinaiticus does include the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas, and Alexandrinus includes 1st and 2nd Clement. So we could say that still, even after Athanasius has this, what we would call a definitive list, the actual function of collecting books into what we would call a New Testament collection is still a little variation. So right towards the end of the 4th century, we can say that we've added quite a bit more definition now. So what are the processes that we just saw? Well, first of all, there was this process of inclusion and exclusion. They very deliberately included all of the 4 Gospels, and in a number of reference points were rather specifically excluding some, Thomas, Peter, the Nazarenes. They included the letters of Paul and some other letters. At the same time, they also were becoming more explicit about excluding certain other documents, the letters of Clement, the Shepherd of Hermas in various cases. So the process was both drawing in books that they considered to be very important and rejecting other books that they considered unimportant. Second thing to consider in this whole process is that it was long and engaging. We just talked about almost 4 centuries of process here before we finally reached essentially the limit of the canon. Different views were held in the church about the validity of different documents, and so this struggle took place over a long period of times. And certainly what was defined as canonical very often was framed in terms of usage and needs of the community. So what became the canon was part and parcel of the church defining itself around these documents. So to a great extent, what it means to be a Christian is to a certain extent defined by what texts one used. Finally, the process of defining canon was oftentimes based upon opposing concepts, heresies. So we talked about Marcion. There's certainly in the 2nd and 3rd century, Gnosticism and Montanism also began to become oppositional points where the church had to define itself against these heresies. We also, one other thing to consider at the very end, and that is that there's a long period of time where pieces of texts seems to circulate independently of the text themselves and sometimes get added on. A couple of quick examples. The story about the adulterous woman, we call the pericope adulterae, in John 7:53 to 8:11, doesn't seem to have been there in the earliest copy of John, or the earliest copies for quite some time. And then later on starts to show up in later documents in this position in John, but also sometimes in a couple different places in the Gospel of Luke. So this story about the adulterous woman seemed to be independent of any of the Gospels and attached itself to various Gospels. Are they scripture? Well, that's an interesting question. Similarly, the original ending of Mark seems to end at 16:8, and yet there were a number of other endings that circulated to the Gospel of Mark that were added much later. Similarly, also the end of the Lord's Prayer in Gospel of Matthew, various liturgical endings became added sometime later. So when we consider what is the canon, what is Scripture, we also have to consider, well, what about these variations that the kind of added itself onto kind of the earliest Scripture in this early period of time? Well, by the time we finally get to the 5th century, things are pretty well defined what we have. We have the 4 Gospels in the core, the center. We have Paul's letters, very important early on, and now we've defined which ones are the Paul's letters that are to be included. And then we have all the other letters, the ones we call the Catholic letters, and the book of Revelation added on finally around the outside of that. And that's the story of how we got this our scriptures. That's our Bible.